Welcome back to RGR Craft, my podcast about craft beer and brewing. Going to be an interesting show today. Taking a little bit of time out to do a few things, get some research in and that kind of thing. But first and foremost, want to say cheers. This particular episode is going to be about homebrewing. Something that I've done the last couple of weeks. I've got a couple of batches in, and I actually recorded it all for you guys. And I'm going to go through it. It just takes a long time to kind of compile all the footage. So just going to have a basic walkthrough of Homebrewing 101 today. My process, along with some classic process, and I'm going to include and use a graphic to kind of follow along. It's from Elevation Brewing in Poncha Springs, Colorado. And it's one of the ones that I refer people to a lot. I'll put a link to it down below in the description, but for the time being, I'll put it up on the screen as we go through. But just want to start from the very basics of what the differences are in how you go about making beer at home. Now, there's a few different steps and a few different concepts to make the stuff that's going on over my shoulder, which, by the way, is some footage that I shot of beer. And I use it as a background at parties and whatever. I'll probably post it up to the channel if you guys want it to use as a backdrop or just put it on a loop in the background. It's pretty beer footage, so we'll call it that. And when you first get started in a homebrew, there's really two kind of avenues you can go down. One is pre-prepared extract, which is basically getting the sugar into a condensed format that you then purchase and then rehydrate and thin it back out so that it forms a wort. And wort is what we work with that we prepare to then ferment to make beer. So that's really, really simple. And you can get that from anywhere down to 1 gallon sizes up to 5 to 10 gallon batches if you really want to do it that way. It's a sticky kind of thick substance that is a little bit difficult to work with at times, but it allows you to make beer on your stovetop rather than having to invest in the equipment, which is a whole other show. But this is just the 101 of the process. Now, the other way that you can go is the way that I brew, and that's with all grain. And that's what professional breweries do as well. And basically, they take different types of barley, as well as you can throw some other things in there like wheat and rye and other grains, basically, cereals. And you go through this process so that you can extract the sugar into the liquid from those grains. And that's what gets into liquid, and then you then ferment that. Very different process, but something that the extract has already done for you, but you're doing on your own at home. Now, the process of getting that sugar out of the grain is a little bit convoluted. Pretty simple steps, as we'll see, but they are important. And you take the base grain, and you can either buy this from a homebrew shop that's got a mill there, or you can buy a mill yourself and mill it. But basically, you want to grind it down as fine as you can without getting it stuck. There are different variations on that, and we can talk about how fine a grist that you use, depending on your equipment setup. I mash in a bag, which is a completely different thing. But you basically just want to break those kernels open so that the starch inside of it is available to be absorbed into a hot liquid. And that's where you put it into what we call a mash tun, ground and ready to be wetted. And there it sits. And then you prepare the water. Now, water preparation is a whole different matter. Again, a big topic on the side about water chemistry, mineral content, all kinds of things that go into it. But the very, very basic. If you're somebody like me that lives on a well up in the mountains, I have pretty hard water, which actually helps in certain styles like IPAs. And you really want to just filter it so that it's clean and get it up to a certain temperature. So you have a boil kettle that you'll use to bring that up to temperature so that you can then add it to the grist and all the broken up grain in a mash tun. And a mash tun is the vessel that holds both the liquid and the grain so that it can work together and become a sweet, sugared liquid. To do that, you have to set it at certain temperatures. And the easiest way to do it is with an igloo cooler, and I have several of them, and I'll have shots for you in the next video. And to pour hot liquid into it. There are a number of websites and software packages that will do the calculations of the temperatures and the volumes for you. But say I'm doing a 6% beer and I have 15 pounds of grain in my cooler, I know that at a certain temperature, around 144, I can get that up to a base temperature of 135, which is the first rest that I usually do, which again is a whole other process of stepped mashes. But what you want to do as a basic mash in is to set a temperature. Somewhere between 148 and 152 is usually the given temperature for a single step mash. And you want to add your water volume so that it mixes in. You want to give it a good stir. You want to cover it up so that it's in an insulated container and you can maintain that temperature for about a 60-minute rest. Maybe 45 will get it done. There are arguments to be had there. But that time allows the enzymes in the grain to break down and release the sugar, absorbing it into the water at that specific temperature. Without temperature control, there is no mashing. So that's a very critical step. After you have the sugared mass of both water and grain that's been absorbed and is sitting in this mash tun, you have to get it out of there. And your goal is to get it into a boil kettle so you can then take it up to a boil, condense it, add hops, and complete the rest of the process. But in order to get it there, you have to drain it and lauter it, which is a classic term for doing a bit of a rinse. They call it a sparge if you're going to do a fly sparge, which is draining the bulk of the liquid out and then rinsing the grain with a rotating or a spread out low volume kind of rinse that then feeds through the grain bed and rinses residual sugars out. You can also do this as a batch sparge, which is adding a significant volume, 2 gallons, whatever, back to the same vessel. Again, stirring to rinse and getting that to drain out as well. Again, just trying to gather up the stray sugars that didn't get into liquid the first time. That's lautering. And the finer you get your mash grist level, the finer it's ground, the more difficult that can get it to actually flow out. So that's part of why mashing in a bag is a phenomenon. We'll talk about that later. Long story short, you get your volume of liquid into the boil kettle and you begin the boil. You take it up to temperature and get it to a nice rolling boil. Where I live at 10,000 feet almost, it doesn't take that long because I'm in the low 190s to get a boil going, which is actually pretty helpful. And at that point, you start the countdown. Most beers are set in recipes as a time countdown from a point forward towards the end point. And you'll hear reference to this as you start to brew your own beer, that there are additions that are set at certain times. Most of them, in order to get a balance, because the wort is so sweet at this point, you need to put some hops in to get a bittering effect. And that's usually called a 60-minute addition because you put it in and you boil down for 60 minutes and that's the end of the boil. Now that will get you some balance. It will get you a little bit of bittering and try to get you to kind of a neutral point. Then later, as you go through the steps, as you get closer to the end of the boil, is when you'll add additional hops for flavors. Especially IPAs, you'll have a large volume of hop additions that you're going to do. For beers like we've reviewed so far on the channel, like Kolsch's, Pale Ales, it's a reduced amount. It's not like an IPA. But you'll have a flavor addition at 20 minutes, at 15 minutes, somewhere in there, and then one probably closer to the end at maybe 5 minutes out. And these are more and more towards lighter effect on the beer as it goes. Bittering is way up here at the top of the boil, and as it comes down, you get more flavor, and at the very end, you get the floral notes. You get the oils that come out of the hops, and that's what actually affects the aroma that comes off the beer later when you crack it open. At this point, you have boiling sugar water with some bittering hops in it that is really hot. And in order to get it to the point where you can start the fermentation process, you have to bring it down. It's also important to avoid going too slowly in your cool down, especially unsealed, as to avoid contamination, any growing bacteria or anything like that. So there is a process that most homebrewers go through that is both whirlpooling, moving the water, and cooling the wort as quickly as possible. And there are different pieces of equipment that will do this. There are plate chillers, there are immersion chillers, which is what I use, and you'll see in the Brew Day video coming up. But the point is, you want to get it from 212 if you're at sea level, or 194 where I am, all the way down into the 70s, upper 60s, because that's where yeast likes to live. And you want to get that temperature of that wort down nice and quickly to not allow any contamination and that kind of thing. Keep it sealed. And at that point, there are other things you can do during the whirlpool, but at that point, you are ready to transfer it to a fermentation vessel and get it ready to ferment. Now comes the fun part. Yeast is your friend. It is an organism that does the magic for you in being wetted, being hydrated, and having the right mineral contents that it needs in order to reproduce so that it can grow to a volume big enough to ferment your beer. You will use either a dry packet or a liquid slurry of yeast cells that you will then put into the cooled wort and let it start doing its work. And the work is that the yeast love sugar. They will eat that sugar and they will give you back two things in return, and that will be carbon dioxide and alcohol. And at that point, they go through the process, and depending on the situation of what the environment is that they're living in, meaning temperature, acidity, a number of nutrients that do help them, oxygenation, those are all aspects that can stress yeast out or make them really happy and clean. And that's how you get flavor from yeast-driven beers, especially beers like Belgian beers, some German strains. These beers depend on the yeast character and the flavors that it puts off in specific situations, mostly in oxygenation and temperature, but also some are pressure related. Some of those Belgian yeasts are really tricky, and they are what produce different flavors in the end beer. So you've set whatever you're going to set and you start the fermentation process. You'll see it start cooking along. It'll develop a krausen, which is a foam, protein-laced foam that will sit on the top of the beer and is giving off the carbon dioxide and shows you that the yeast is working. And as it goes through, it completes to the point where it can eat all the sugar that it can, and then it will die off and it will fall out. And at that point, your beer will start to clear up. You'll know that it's done, and then you'll be ready for the last couple of phases, which is transferring to either keg or bottle so that you can condition it a little bit. Now, when I first did homebrew or brewing of any kind, back in the 90s, I messed with bottles constantly. And quickly decided I wasn't going to do that anymore. These days, if I have a competition I'm entering or something like that, I will bottle a few beers up in order to enter that contest. But the rest of the time, I keg everything because it's a mass transfer. It's a single entity that you have to keep clean and keep sanitized. And sanitation is paramount through this entire process. That's something that we'll have to cover in depth if you guys want to get into that kind of nitty gritty. But once you transfer into a keg, you start the process of adding gas to it. The natural carbonation, the carbon dioxide that bubbled out of it, is a great start, but it's not enough to give you the finished product of what you expect in a carbonated beverage when you open an actual beer. So you'll start adding gas to this liquid vessel that is pressure capable in all kegs. And you'll hook up a line, get some compressed CO2 that you'll run into it, and you'll just let it sit. There are different ways. There's burst carbonation. There's the trickle. There's all kinds of ways that we can talk about in the future. But the basic is forced carbonation is pressing through PSI, getting an overpressure amount of CO2 gas inside the vessel so that the liquid will absorb it. It takes time and it takes... temperature has an effect on how fast the process happens, but that is how you carbonate a beer. At the same time, it's aging, and that yeast is continuing to fall out, the beer is continuing to clear up. There are things you can do to speed that process, but that's a whole other topic. And at the end of the day, a week, a month later, somewhere in between, depending on what you're trying to do, you have fully carbonated beer in a vessel that you are able to serve. That's really the process that you go through in order to produce your own beer. And at that point, you're talking about fermentation for 4 to 7 days, carbonation for 3 to 7 days. So from start to finish, you can have beer in a couple of weeks that you made to your specifications the way you want it to be, and enjoy that with your friends and family just because you decided to. I will warn you, though, at that point, it becomes addictive and you start designing recipes for all kinds of things, and it becomes difficult to actually get them all done. But that's the process. That's how to homebrew the RGR way. And there are a lot of little side notes. I'm sure we'll get into them as this channel progresses, but I wanted to get you guys this video for a little bit of basic what the process is and see if you're into it. If you are, make sure you leave your notes below. Love your comments. You guys are doing great. I know that there's more and more people joining the channel, so if you're new, please hit the sub, the notification, click that thumbs up if that's what you're liking. And I appreciate all the comments so far. So we'll be doing more of this as we go along. And I'm really looking forward to this becoming a bigger part of the RGR podcast family. So thanks for all your time. I'll talk to you next time.